But I want to give you a chance, of course, to respond to what Mr. Vedrin was saying.
Well, I'd like to not just to respond to what Mr. Vedrin said, but I'd like to say something. Ukrainian crisis, which is a kind of touchstone today. Even before the Minsk agreements, let's recall how these were first introduced. I don't like talking about sanctions, but I'm not doing it to say we don't like it. Of course, we don't like it. We are going to go on living with the knowledge that such discriminatory measures can be now adopted against us. But let's just recall the logic of that confrontation, which it is my conviction that it is some events that happened long before the Ukrainian crisis, and that show that the moves to contagion has been in place for quite a while. So a large group of those sanctions were imposed by the European Union after the Malaysian plane was downed over Ukraine. No one said that a full investigation needed to be made into it. Russia alone insisted that the UN Security Council should adopt a resolution demanding an open and responsible, internationally sound investigation of the case, and that the Security Council was to be. Not a single paper was presented to the UN Security Council, and the self-proclaimed research made up of the Dutch, the Ukrainians, and some Australians, I think, and, did not even include Malaysia, a country whose plane was downed. It took them 6 months to invite Malaysia there. But the sanctions were imposed promptly. And everybody had the feeling that, we have this pretext, why don't we impose sanctions on the basis of that? The next block of sanctions was imposed in September 2014, a few days after the first Minsk agreements were signed. They were welcomed by everyone, but the then chairman of the European Council, without consultations with other European nations, signed those rules imposing sanctions. And we know that some European leaders said they were not pleased with that because this was undermining Russia-EU relations. But these opinions were expressed in private, not publicly. As to, then the sanctions were prolonged soon after Minsk II agreements were signed. It looks as if the European Union was long looking for a formula that would get the situation out of this stalemate. And their formula seemed to be, okay, we're going to lift sanctions as soon as Russia fulfills the Minsk agreements. But we heard even here today that most of the things that are to be done under the Minsk agreements are to be done by Kiev, including the decentralization clause that was written by Chancellor Merkel and Prime Minister Hollande. This was something very clearly stated. No further language changes are needed then. But this formula, which read that sanctions are going to be lifted as soon as Russia does everything in accordance with Minsk, is precisely what Kiev likes to hear now. Those authorities that don't want this decentralization. And it's they who are undermining Minsk agreements. And they say sanctions should be kept in place because Russia is unable to make separatists lay down arms. Let me ask you to remember that the people that are called separatists were one of the parties that signed the agreements that stated the need for a sovereign Ukraine. So they are not separatists, not even technically. Today or yesterday, we met within the Ukraine contact group, and our Ukrainian colleagues said that the political side of the Minsk agreements would be started only after 3 months of pure, uninterrupted ceasefire. Now, this is not going to happen. Certainly, somebody would be found there, even from the Ukrainian side, that would make at least one shot, and that would undermine the whole scheme. We would like our European colleagues to understand that. In fact, I'm sure that most Europeans understand it already if they are following this process. And they are probably mentioning this to their Ukrainian counterparties. Let's put it plainly. Let's stop undermining Minsk. Let's start the open dialogue between Kiev and Donbass as prescribed in black and white in the Minsk document. It says there directly that the law on the special status of on Donbass is to be approved by the Donbass representatives, and the amendments to the Ukrainian constitution is also to be approved and agreed with them. So that's the source of the trouble, and the situation with the sanctions against Russia started long before the Ukrainian crisis. We can recall how our American friends responded to the situation around Edward Snowden when they demanded that Russia extradite him, and they demanded that we should do something which is not very humane. And when we explained to them nicely and clearly couldn't do that, President Obama cancelled his visit to Moscow that he was planning before the G20 meeting. So you can just compare the level of the slights and the level of retaliations. And let me remind you of the Magnitsky law that was adopted long before and then supported by the European decisions. And now an independent documentalist has made a documentary about the making of the Magnitsky law. He was banned from showing his film in Europe and then in America. People betraying their secret thoughts by their overt actions. We must remember that there are countries in the world that affect the global situation more than some other countries do. And the United States will have the desire to be always first and stronger than the rest of the world. It's in their genes, I suppose. But, I'd like to quote from Churchill. He said, the United States will always do the right thing after they have tried out all the wrong things.